This is Brian Rideout from Deathtrap Games, and I want to talk a little bit about one-to-one time in fantasy role-playing games, and how that changes the way they're played. I'm currently involved in a low fantasy gaming group that is using one-to-one time. And it is a really different way of playing. Right now there's a lot of talk about one-to-one time in the OSR community, but I don't think that right now we are seeing a very useful conversation, partially because a lot of people don't really understand what it is and how it works. And I'm finding that a lot of people are doing a poor job of describing it and making sure people understand what they mean when they talk about one-to-one time. As someone who's a little on the fence about it, and who also is very flexible about how games are played, I feel like I'm in a great position to talk about what one-to-one time is, what it's good for, and what it's not good for, and probably the best way to use it. So, before I can talk about one-to-one time, I want to talk about how most games are played, and I'm going to call that, for the sake of argument, cinematic time. In cinematic time, you can hit pause when the session time runs out, even if you're in the middle of a dungeon. The next session, the DM will say, okay, here's where we left off, you're in this room, let's go. The game can feel a lot like a novel. It is a flow of constant events and excitement. When an adventure stops, when it completes, there's usually a chunk of downtime between, and that's not really handled very clearly. The GM will usually say something like, okay, we'll pick up again in about 3 months unless you guys have something in particular you want to do. And then there'll be a whole session, or the start of a session, where they will go from player to player saying, okay, what do you want to get done? What do you want to get done? What do you want to get done? And treat it a bit like a combat sequence where each player is rolling to see if they accomplish what it is they set out to accomplish. If you handle that well, like, say, Hanker and Fairnail's ICRPG Core 2E does, you can probably get away with that without too much trouble. But it can kill momentum. There are also some other downsides to playing in cinematic time. One of the big ones is that player characters rarely do things that require a lot of downtime. They tend not to research spells, create items, found and run dominions. Also, when you are in the adventure, players don't feel nearly as much crunch as they can playing one-to-one. In general, the characters may feel time pressure, and the players may feel like they can't afford to faff around, especially if the DM is using random encounters. But the players, generally speaking, aren't going to feel a huge amount of pressure to get on with the game. Modern editions of D&D really amplified this. In 3rd edition, you had the problem of what was referred to as the 1-hour workday for adventurers. They'd go into a dungeon, fight 3 or 4 encounters, and when they were starting to get low on resources, they'd back out of the dungeon and sleep for 8 hours before going back in. In 5th edition, and 4th edition for that matter, with the short rest mechanic, players are literally going into a safe or reasonably safe seeming place in the dungeon, casting Arcane Lock, and taking a nap then and there. The way spells like Rope Trick work in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons makes this a lot easier. And so what is one-to-one time? Well, it comes from the way Gygax explains how he preferred to track time in the 1st edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide. He suggested that the time in the game flows more or less in sync with the time outside the game. So, you have a day between game sessions, then a full calendar day passes in your game world too. This also meant that downtime was occurring between sessions of D&D. Because you were not pausing very often, what would happen is you finished your dungeon, you have a week between sessions, the DM will say, okay, you had a week between sessions, let's go ahead and figure out what your characters are doing for that week. And ideally, you'd be talking to your players frequently enough that you would be doing most of the prep work for that, getting the list of what they're doing and the like before a day or two before the game session. Part of that meant that your players had to know how to budget time. They had to know, for example, how long it would take them to get home from the dungeon, how long it would take them to get back if they were going back in, and then figure out what they were going to do in the time between. And that did mean that there was a lot more planning involved. They didn't usually roleplay in town stuff. You don't roleplay out talking to the shady character in the bar. The DM will tell you sometime during the week, your character met a shady person in the bar and this is what they told them. It also meant that if a full week had passed and your characters weren't available, then you will have to pick something up with other characters. If your player characters were way off 3 days or 4 days away, and they still have a day or two before they get to town, well, then you pick up a different set of characters and send them on an adventure too. And while you play an adventure out with those characters, your first group of characters can come back, take their downtime, and next game session you can pick back up with them. In theory, this really enables the juggling of up to 3 or 4 player characters without too much in the way of difficulty or complexity. Your GM simply has to have a calendar available somewhere that shows where each character is going to be on a given day. This is, by the way, going to constantly be a lot more work for the DM than most of the other forms of play. I'll give you an example. In my system, we are using training, just like in 1st edition Dungeons & Dragons. My character Lieres, a lovable scoundrel of a thief, finally got to the point where he could gain 2nd level. He also had suffered a severe injury and he needed some care. All told, he needed to be out of the game for about 2 weeks of time. That meant for one session where my party wanted to scout out another dungeon, he simply wasn't available. By the time we got back, he'd been sitting around for 2 days, so I had 2 days to figure out what trouble he was getting into, what rumors he could gather, before he could rejoin the party. Then on the 3rd session, we could all go out together. It also meant that I have another character who doesn't tend to go on a lot of adventures simply because she's always doing something else. A smart DM will find ways to track this, and you can in fact earn experience points and get a lot accomplished when your characters are out of direct action. Players tend to use a lot more item creation, a lot more research, a lot more gathering of information. They also tend to use abilities that get neglected, like the thief ability to set traps, and they do a lot more wilderness exploration because these things can all be handled off-scene. If you have something like a complex wilderness voyage, which can be a little boring in D&D, the DM can do all the rolling for you. You can say, I'm at this point, I want to get to that point. He can roll to see if you stayed on track, if you got lost, if you had encounters or severe weather that slowed you down. And if you ran into any dangerous random encounters, those can be the first things that get played to resolve. Or, in many cases, the DM can simply resolve it on his own, so that you can be told, okay, between point A and point B, you guys were hassled by a group of wolves. You took a little bit of damage, but you're okay now. You did lose a hireling, however. This, of course, means that you do have to trust the DM to run your character smartly. Now, when you actually get to the dungeon, there is a serious amount of pressure to try and get it done in the one session. Ideally, you'd like to be in the dungeon and out of the dungeon by the end of the session so that you can take advantage of that downtime. Otherwise, the GM has a couple of choices. They can either pause time like in cinematic time, and you just miss out on a week of the game world evolving, or they have to figure out what happens when your characters didn't get out of the dungeon. This is where a lot of the confusion is happening in the dialogue right now. With my DM, if we're stuck in the middle of a dungeon and we really want to go on, he doesn't see any reason why he should try to be rigid about the way he's playing and deny us the enjoyment of exploring the rest of this dungeon he had rather cleverly handcrafted. So, we've paused time. But It's also possible, if there's only a couple of rooms left, that the DM could gloss it over and say, okay, you searched the last couple of rooms, then you left the dungeon. Or if your characters were deep in the middle of a dark tomb and he wants to handle something else, he can say your characters got captured or lost or something happened, just to make sure that he can jump to a different group in another session, or handle some other event that is unfolding while those player characters are down in the tomb. It also means that you don't necessarily have to play one day in your game session. If your player characters want to handle something like a wilderness trek in game time, then you can do that without having to, and say, okay, this one session covered several weeks of time, and so we are going to have to handle several weeks of time for each of the other player characters who were running tasks in the background. It's all about balance. And I find it really weird that you would hear certain people on the internet advocating, for example, that a character who is left in the dungeon dies. You have to be in and out by the end of the session. It doesn't make sense, and it seems, in essence, unfun. But it is built on this ideal that you definitely see in some groups of the OSR of trying to play the game exactly word for word how Gygax played it. Personally, I'd love to see more records of his actual play to see what happened when someone did indeed end up stuck in the middle of the dungeon at the end of a session. I will say this, even though the DM may choose to pause or may choose to gloss it over or may simply say you left the dungeon and you'll have to come back in a week, you definitely see that pressure. And it comes in two forms. The DM tends to create more discreet, tighter kinds of adventures. You see a lot more 5-room dungeons. You see a lot more tentpole adventures where there's only one monster, only one type of monster, where you have a lot of lead up to a single major encounter. And when you are dealing with larger dungeons, they tend to have distinct sections, like these 5 rooms are the lair of this creature, or this 8 rooms have been cordoned off by this faction within the dungeon, so that the player characters can explore a discrete chunk that feels like a complete adventure, leave the dungeon and come back and handle another discrete chunk. The Caves of Chaos are perfect for this kind of play. I'm going to give you a great example of this. About 3 weeks ago, my player characters, all of them, found that they were between adventures. A couple of them needed to go on some training, and one of them had a mission she had to undertake to speak to a noble in another town, but that could be done by taking on a job as a caravan guard. Another couple of our party members were badly injured and needed some time to rest. So we grabbed an undersized group and a couple of animals, and we just decided to go scout out a location we saw earlier, see if there was anything interesting to it, maybe if there was a small adventure location or some secret to discover. What we found was a fairly large dungeon hidden underneath this patch of blasted earth that was cursed. We did a handful of rooms, and then the night was getting late, and we had an encounter where one of my player characters was given an option to negotiate that we would help end the haunting of the dungeon, but that we wanted time to go prepare a larger group. He was placed under a curse until that was done. In the week that followed, we were able to get our characters back, collect up a couple of my characters who were training, hire a group of hirelings, and then come back. And we handled all that by Discord Messenger between sessions. So we started fresh the next day with another jab at the dungeon. This time we played hard because it was a great dungeon. It was a fantastic encounter. And at the end of it, we still had about 7 rooms left to explore, given how we knew the dungeon was likely to be laid out. And we didn't want to stop. Now, the DM could have forced us to go to the next town over. He could have said, if you guys don't leave the dungeon, you're going to end up cursed, or the last remaining specters are going to have your souls for lunch. But instead, he realized that this wouldn't be the fun way to do it. So for this session, at least, we are paused between sessions. At the end of our next game session, we will finish looking through these things, and then we'll probably head back to town, sell our loot, which should be considerable, and then it will go back to a week of downtime before the next session. It's also worth noting that we actually managed to gain a couple of levels worth of experience so far on our downtime. During the adventure before this, we had found a dungeon that was full of barrels of expensive mead, exotic ales, and sacramental wines that were worth a huge amount, but we had no way to carry out of the dungeon. While our player characters were doing the scouting and the like, a couple of trusted hirelings and henchmen, some retainers, and one player character who had lost a leg and so was still getting used to moving without it, decided to head back to the dungeon, collect up all that booze with a team of teamsters and porters, bring it back and sell it. We managed to get that stuff out of the dungeon. There was no need for us to go in. It all happened in between sessions, but we came back with our characters being 13,000 gold pieces richer, and thus 13,000 experience points richer, to split between the party at least. There is some benefits to playing in this one-to-one time frame. You do get a world that seems less focused on your characters. It's a game where you have to treat a dungeon raid like a game of chess. You have the time to do the research. You have the time to make the magic items. You have the time to scout and spy. You are more likely to do things like hire hirelings as well. And because you're occasionally going to have points where your characters are not available because they're still in transit between sessions, that you're going to use hirelings, henchmen, or another set of player characters. Most of the players in our group have somewhere between 3 and 4 player characters, who almost never adventure as a complete group, but instead we are all working towards resolving one major campaign threat, a prophecy that is suggesting that seems to be looming over us. Some characters are making investigations, some characters are going on adventures to build up our contacts and and build strong alliances. Some of them are going on missions for the local baron to make sure our whole group has a strong relationship with the local authorities. All of these adventures are working together towards a common cause, even though they're often happening on radically different parts of the map. One thing to remember is when you're talking about the way Gygax wrote the game and the way a lot of people play it, is that the game has very little to do with what's on your character sheet. You're not interested in character abilities. The game is there to challenge the players, and it's about the players' ability to think their way through a dungeon, to treat every dungeon like a game of chess, to have strategies. This constant engagement with the DM, this constant planning, all this downtime that allows you to choose what to hire, what equipment to bring, what information to gather, that becomes a central part of how you play the game. And some classes like the Assassin play far more effectively if you can have them say things like, I want them to infiltrate this faction in our downtime. Now that said, there are some downsides to one-to-one play as well. It involves a lot more player engagement. I can't just put my notes away and then grab them and read them a half hour before the session and dive in. I have to be having a conversation with my DM. It also means the DM's doing a lot more rolling, a lot more work, and is occasionally managing the players' characters behind the scenes. He has to have a calendar and figure out exactly how long it takes characters to get from point A to point B, or to accomplish their downtime. For my money, I think that it's an interesting style of play, and it, like all things with role-playing games, it depends on the experience you want to create. If you want this highly strategic experience where your players are constantly thinking ahead, constantly managing their time and juggling a handful of NPC or a handful of player characters and keeping a big stable of retainers and the like, this is a really good structure. If, on the other hand, you do want it to feel like a novel, it's going to interfere. And there's very much a style challenge for the DM that comes from that question of what happens when my players want to finish this dungeon and we just don't have time. And I think that is the point of contention that's been confusing people in the conversation online. Anyway, I hope that helped, and hopefully I will be able to make a few more videos like this when I think that I have something useful to add to what is a pretty interesting conversation on the OSR Twitter feeds. Thanks a lot.